5 minutes ago, the palace released a statement so brief, so carefully worded, that most people missed its true weight. But behind the formal language was a decision that rewired the balance of royal power overnight. One name was conspicuously restrained, one privilege quietly erased. And at the center of it all stood Prince William, no longer waiting, no longer deferring, and no longer willing to protect what had become untouchable for decades. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The statement did not arrive with ceremony or warning. It appeared suddenly, clipped and controlled, released at a moment when most eyes were elsewhere. That timing was not accidental. Insiders understood immediately that the palace wasn't trying to persuade the public, it was signaling finality to those who mattered most. This was not about explanation. It was about confirmation. The kind that closes doors rather than opening conversations. Within minutes, phones inside royal offices began vibrating, not with questions, but with quiet acknowledgments that something irreversible had just occurred. What made the announcement so destabilizing was not what it said, but what it dared to state plainly. The word permanent sat at the center of the message like a fault line. In a system built on precedent, reversibility, and quiet correction, permanence is rare. It implies preparation. It implies consensus. And most of all, it implies that whatever had been removed was not coming back, no matter who objected, no matter what pressures followed. For seasoned palace watchers, that single word confirmed this was not a symbolic adjustment. It was a structural removal. The privilege itself had long existed beyond scrutiny, protected by habit and silence rather than formal defense. It was never meant to be questioned because it had never needed to be. Generations before William had simply worked around it, treating it as an immovable fixture of palace life. To remove it was to acknowledge that it had grown too large, too influential, too detached from accountability. And by doing so openly, William was not merely adjusting an internal arrangement, he was declaring a shift in how authority would be exercised from this moment forward. Early reactions from within the palace were telling. There was no visible resistance, no leaked rebuttals, no anonymous briefings pushing back. That silence spoke volumes. Those who understood the machinery of royal power recognized that this decision had been locked in long before the public ever saw the statement. Advisors knew it had survived internal challenge. Senior figures understood it carried protections of its own. This was not a move made in anger. It was the outcome of a line finally being crossed. Perhaps most striking was the absence of Camilla's name. Not erased, not highlighted, simply restrained. That omission was deliberate, designed to deny reaction the oxygen it feeds on. By refusing to frame the decision as personal, the palace stripped it of drama while amplifying its authority. And in doing so, Prince William stepped into a role he had long been preparing for. One defined not by inheritance, but by intervention. But to understand why this decision happened now, and why it could never be reversed, we have to go back to the privilege itself, and why it was once considered inviolable. For years, there was one privilege inside the palace that functioned like an invisible crown. It didn't appear in public schedules. It wasn't debated in meetings. And it was never ever challenged. Those who held it shaped decisions without leaving fingerprints. And for Camilla, this privilege wasn't just symbolic, it was power. Power that now, in a single stroke, no longer exists. Behind closed doors, this privilege controlled far more than appearances or ceremonial presence. It dictated access, who could be heard, who could wait, and who would never be invited into certain rooms at all. It influenced the flow of information before it ever reached official channels, shaping outcomes long before they were formally decided. Those operating under its protection could redirect conversations subtly, framing choices in ways that felt inevitable rather than imposed. It was governance without signatures, authority without accountability, and it thrived precisely because it was never named aloud. What made this privilege so potent was that it operated beyond rank or title. It did not require public legitimacy because it relied on proximity, trust, and habit. Staff learned quickly where real influence lived, and they adjusted accordingly. Appointments were softened or stalled. Access was expedited or quietly denied. Careers advanced or plateaued based on alignment rather than merit. Over time, the system began to orbit around this unseen center of gravity, treating it not as an anomaly, but as a natural law of palace life. There was an unspoken understanding that this privilege could not be revoked, not because it was written into any charter, but because challenging it meant destabilizing too much at once. Previous heirs understood the risk, they calculated the fallout, and they chose caution. To confront it would have meant confronting relationships, loyalties, and long-standing compromises that had kept the institution functioning, if not entirely balanced. Silence became the safer option. Deference became tradition. But silence has consequences. The longer the privilege went unchecked, the more it reshaped the hierarchy itself. Authority blurred. Responsibility scattered. Decisions appeared collective while being quietly guided from one consistent direction. Over time, the palace adapted to this imbalance, building routines around it, excusing it as continuity. What began as influence hardened into expectation. What was once informal became indispensable. Removing it then did more than strip power from one individual. It rewrote the internal map of the palace overnight. Suddenly, lines of authority snapped back into clarity. Access was no longer assumed. Decisions required justification again. Staff found themselves recalibrating instincts they had relied on for years. The system felt exposed, almost raw, as though a stabilizing illusion had been pulled away to reveal how much had depended on it. And in that exposure, one truth became unavoidable: this privilege had outgrown its usefulness. It no longer served balance, it served preservation. And preservation, when left unchallenged, eventually demands correction. And yet, Prince William didn't just challenge this unspoken rule, he shattered it, setting the stage for a confrontation years in the making. Prince William had waited. He had observed. He had absorbed the lessons of restraint taught by generations before him. But patience has a limit, and insiders say that limit was crossed quietly, repeatedly, and deliberately. What followed was not impulsive. It was calculated. And when William finally acted, it was not as a son, but as the future authority of the crown. The pressure that built inside him did not arrive all at once. It accumulated through moments others dismissed as minor, through decisions that felt increasingly misaligned with the institution he was meant to protect. Each time influence was exercised without accountability. Each time access overruled structure, the cost became clearer. William was not reacting to a single event, he was responding to a pattern. A slow erosion that threatened to redefine the monarchy before he ever had the chance to lead it. This decision had been prepared long before today, shaped in private conversations and silent recalculations. Advisors recall meetings where William listened more than he spoke, where he asked questions that revealed how deeply he understood the machinery beneath the ceremony. He studied outcomes, not optics. He tracked how power moved when no one was watching. By the time the final step was taken, it no longer felt like a leap, it felt like the inevitable conclusion of a process already complete. Still, the emotional cost was undeniable. Confronting entrenched influence meant confronting history, loyalty, and expectation all at once. William knew what this would signal. He knew it would be read as cold by some, ruthless by others. But restraint, he had learned, could become its own form of complicity. To protect the future, he would have to absorb the discomfort of the present. That burden was his alone to carry. What set William apart in this moment was not aggression, but clarity. Unlike previous approaches that favored quiet compromise, his leadership drew a firm line between respect and permission. He did not seek to humiliate or provoke. He sought to realign. Where others hesitated, he concluded. Where tradition once delayed action, he reframed it as responsibility. The shift was subtle but unmistakable, and those closest to the process felt it immediately. There came a moment when advisors realized persuasion was no longer possible. The debate ended not with raised voices, but with resolve. William had already weighed the consequences, he had accepted the fallout, and most importantly, he had decided that delay itself was the greater risk. This was not rebellion against the crown, it was correction in service of it. A recalibration meant to restore balance, not dismantle legacy. By the time the decision moved forward, there was no drama left inside the room, only certainty. William had stepped beyond the role of cautious heir and into that of decisive authority, signaling that the era of untouchable influence was ending not out of spite, but out of necessity. But while William was preparing to act, Camilla was operating under the assumption that her position remained unchallengeable, and that assumption would soon collapse. Inside Camilla's circle, confidence had hardened into certainty. Access was routine. Influence was expected. The system had always adjusted around her, not against her. That's why the first internal signals felt unreal. Meetings shifted. Permissions stalled. Doors that once opened automatically didn't. And by the time the truth became undeniable, it was already too late. At first, the changes were easy to dismiss. A rescheduled briefing here. A delayed response there. Minor inconveniences framed as temporary disruptions. Those closest to Camilla had lived through palace fluctuations before, and they had learned to trust the system to correct itself. Influence, after all, had never required defense. It had simply existed. So when early warning signs appeared, they were interpreted as noise rather than signal administrative hiccups, competing priorities, nothing more. But normalization can be a dangerous shield. Camilla's influence had become so embedded in daily operations that its absence felt inconceivable. Staff had long adjusted their instincts to accommodate it, shaping decisions before they reached formal review. Over time, that adaptation became invisible. No one thought to question it, because questioning it had never been rewarded. And so, when the system began to pull back quietly, deliberately, there was no mechanism inside her circle to recognize what was happening in real time. The withdrawal of institutional support did not announce itself. It crept in through silence. Requests that once received immediate acknowledgement were met with procedural delay. Advisors who once volunteered reassurance began offering neutrality instead. The warmth that smoothed over uncertainty cooled into formality. Nothing was explicitly denied, yet nothing flowed as it once had. The palace was not pushing Camilla out, it was stepping away. And that distinction made all the difference. What made the situation worse was the absence of challenge from within her own ranks. Loyalty, cultivated over years, became hesitation. To question the shift felt disloyal. To acknowledge vulnerability felt unnecessary. Confidence lingered long after conditions had changed, blinding those closest to her to the urgency of response. By the time concern surfaced, it arrived too late to alter the outcome. Momentum had already shifted elsewhere. The psychological impact was profound. Influence had always been felt, not measured. Its sudden absence created a vacuum that no title could fill. Familiar rhythms vanished. Assumptions collapsed. Camilla found herself navigating a palace that no longer bent instinctively in her direction, and the realization cut deeper than any formal rebuke could have. Exclusion does not announce itself loudly, it isolates quietly, stripping certainty piece by piece until doubt becomes undeniable. Inside the palace, isolation is rarely reversed once it sets in. Networks reconfigure. Habits adapt. New centers of gravity form. What was once indispensable becomes peripheral, not through confrontation, but through neglect. And neglect, in an institution built on continuity, is often the most final judgment of all. Yet the most devastating aspect of this move wasn't the loss itself, it was how final the palace made it. Royal decisions are often reversible, quietly amended, softened over time. But this one wasn't. The palace didn't leave room for reinterpretation. No review clause. No future reconsideration. Just permanence. And insiders say that was intentional. Designed not only to end a privilege, but to prevent its resurrection under any future circumstances. Permanence inside the monarchy is never accidental. It is engineered carefully, threaded through layers of protocol that transform a decision into a fixture. This was not framed as a response to circumstance, but as a recalibration of structure. The language used was precise, almost cold, chosen to survive scrutiny not just today but years from now. Every word carried weight because every word was designed to close a door that had once remained quietly ajar. What made this decision so unassailable was how deeply it was embedded beyond personal relationships. It did not hinge on sentiment, loyalty, or family dynamics. Instead, it was anchored in process. By routing the decision through institutional channels rather than individual authority, the palace ensured that no future shift in mood or alliance could undo it. This was not William acting alone, it was the system aligning behind him. locking the outcome into place. The procedural language mattered more than the announcement itself. Clauses were crafted to eliminate ambiguity. Definitions were narrowed. Authority was reassigned in ways that could not be informally bypassed. Where privilege once existed through habit and assumption, it was now replaced with explicit boundaries. Insiders describe it as administrative surgery, quiet, meticulous, and irreversible. There were no loopholes left open because none were needed. The intention was finality. To staff and advisors, the signal was unmistakable. This was a line drawn not just for Camilla, but for everyone watching. Influence would no longer operate in the margins. Access would no longer be inherited through proximity alone. The palace was reasserting its internal discipline, reminding those within its walls that permanence cuts both ways. Privileges granted without structure can be removed with structure, and once removed, they do not return. The reason reversal was impossible went deeper than optics. Undoing this decision would now trigger constitutional instability. It would expose fractures the palace had just sealed. To reverse course would be to admit miscalculation, inviting questions about authority at the very top. In an institution built on continuity, such uncertainty is dangerous. Permanence in this context was not rigidity, it was protection. For Camilla, the implications were profound. Her future role was not erased, but it was irrevocably reframed. Without that privilege, her position became defined by limits rather than reach. She remained present, but no longer pivotal. In a monarchy where relevance is measured by influence rather than visibility, that shift altered everything. The palace had not removed her, it had repositioned her, decisively and without appeal. And as the palace sealed its position, the ripple effects spread far beyond Camilla alone. When a single privilege falls, it exposes every other imbalance still standing. Within hours, the royal family felt the tremor. Conversations stalled, alliances recalculated, and unspoken loyalties were suddenly tested. Because if one untouchable position could be stripped, no one was as secure as they once believed. Behind closed doors, reactions unfolded in careful silence. Senior royals did not argue openly, they assessed. Some leaned back, absorbing what had finally happened after years of quiet frustration. For them, this was not a shock, but a release, a long-delayed correction that restored order to a system they felt had drifted too far from its center. They spoke cautiously, but their relief was unmistakable. Authority, they believed, had finally been realigned with responsibility. Others, however, felt something closer to alarm. To them, this was not correction but precedent. If one privilege could be erased so completely, what protections remain for anyone whose influence rested on tradition rather than codified role? The fear was not about Camilla alone. It was about exposure, about the realization that informal power, once accepted as permanent, was now vulnerable to review and removal. That uncertainty spread faster than any official briefing ever could. As reactions diverged, alliances began to shift without announcement. Support that once flowed instinctively in one direction paused, then redirected. Conversations became more guarded. Assumptions were re-examined. Those who had relied on proximity to influence found themselves reassessing their positions, while others sensed opportunity in the vacuum left behind. Nothing was declared, yet everything changed. The palace does not fracture loudly, it rearranges quietly. What unsettled many was how decisively this emboldened future authority. The message was clear. Waiting was no longer the strategy. Action was. Prince William had demonstrated that intervention was not only possible, but effective. For some, that clarity brought reassurance. For others, it felt like a warning shot across the institution. Power was consolidating, and it was doing so with intent. Emotionally, the divide was sharp. Tradition-oriented figures mourned the loss of predictability, the comfort of knowing how things had always worked. Control-oriented figures, by contrast, saw necessity. They argued that unchecked influence had weakened the crown more than reform ever could. The debate was not spoken aloud, but it was felt in every cautious exchange, every delayed response, every recalculated stance. In that tension, the royal family confronted a difficult truth. Stability had been purchased at the cost of imbalance, and imbalance could no longer be ignored. The privilege's removal forced a reckoning that extended far beyond one individual. It challenged how loyalty was defined, how authority was earned, and how the future would be shaped. And while these internal shifts unfolded in measured silence, something far less predictable was building beyond the palace walls. But the public reaction would prove just as destabilizing and far less controlled. Outside the palace walls, reaction fractured instantly. Some called it justice. Others called it cruelty. And many sensed there was more to the story than the palace was willing to admit. Because when power is removed this decisively, the public instinctively asks one question: what forced their hand? Within hours, the narrative split into opposing currents. For one side, this was long overdue, a rare moment where accountability pierced centuries of insulation. They saw strength in decisiveness, even courage, interpreting the move as proof that no one remained above consequence. For others, the decision felt abrupt, even brutal, raising fears about what happens when tradition is interrupted without explanation. Sympathy and suspicion existed side by side, fueling an emotional divide that grew louder with every passing hour. The palace, meanwhile, offered nothing further. No background briefings, no clarifications, no anonymous sources stepping in to soften interpretation. That silence was intentional, but it proved combustible. In the absence of guidance, speculation rushed to fill the void. Was this about influence gone too far? A private disagreement turned structural reckoning? Or something more serious, hidden carefully behind procedural language? The refusal to elaborate did not calm the public, it sharpened its curiosity. Media narratives quickly escalated the tension. Headlines framed the decision as both power play and moral stand, depending on perspective. Commentators dissected tone, timing, and omission, searching for clues in what had not been said. Every pause, every carefully neutral phrase became evidence of something withheld. Analysis blurred into conjecture, and conjecture hardened into belief. The story was no longer just about what had happened, it was about what might have been concealed. Silence only intensified scrutiny. Each hour without clarification deepened the sense that the palace was protecting something larger than appearances. The more controlled the response became, the more volatile public reaction grew. Questions multiplied. Assumptions spread. The absence of denial became confirmation in the minds of many. In trying to contain the narrative, the palace inadvertently widened it, allowing emotion to outrun fact. Public pressure began reshaping expectations almost immediately. If this level of intervention was possible now, what else could change? What other untouchable arrangements might be reconsidered? For supporters, this opened the door to reform. For critics, it raised fears of instability. Either way, the public began to recalibrate its understanding of royal power not as static inheritance, but as something increasingly exercised in real time. Through it all, one truth emerged clearly. The palace had underestimated how deeply invested the public had become in the meaning behind this decision. It was no longer enough to announce permanence. People wanted motive. And motive, once questioned, rarely remains private for long. Yet for Prince William, the most consequential outcome wasn't public reaction, it was what this decision revealed about the future. Strip away the emotion, and one truth remains. This wasn't personal. It was structural. Prince William wasn't correcting the past, he was securing the future. And in doing so, he sent an unmistakable message about how authority will function from this point forward, and who will no longer operate above it. At the heart of this move was a quiet but decisive redefinition of where power truly resides. For years, influence had drifted away from formal roles and into informal corridors, sustained by habit rather than mandate. William pulled it back to the center, not with confrontation, but with architecture. Authority was no longer something assumed through proximity or longevity. It was something exercised through structure, accountability, and clear limits. That shift alone altered the internal balance of the monarchy more than any public speech ever could. Symbolism mattered more than optics here. This wasn't about appearing strong, it was about being unambiguous. The removal of the privilege sent a message that did not rely on explanation, because it relied on consequence. In royal systems, symbolism becomes law when it is enforced without hesitation. By acting decisively and allowing the outcome to speak for itself, William reinforced the idea that the crown's stability depends not on tradition preserved at all costs, but on tradition governed with intent. The signal to future consorts and advisors was impossible to miss. Influence would no longer be inherited through association alone. Access would no longer translate automatically into authority. Those who operate near power would be expected to respect its boundaries rather than reshape them. The era of undefined reach had ended. In its place stood a clearer, colder framework, one that rewarded alignment with structure over loyalty to individuals. This is why many believe William's reign is already taking shape, long before it formally begins. His approach is not reactionary, it is preventative. He is building guardrails now to avoid crises later, understanding that unchecked influence does not announce itself until it has already become unmanageable. Where previous generations delayed difficult corrections, William appears willing to absorb discomfort early to preserve long-term control. In this recalibration, control now outweighs tradition, not because tradition lacks value, but because tradition without oversight becomes vulnerability. The monarchy's survival has always depended on adaptation disguised as continuity. William's move stripped away the disguise. It acknowledged that governance, even within a royal institution, must evolve to remain credible. Stability, in this framework, is not passive, it is enforced. The long-term implications for royal governance are profound. Authority is consolidating around process rather than personality. Decision-making is becoming less negotiable, less dependent on invisible hierarchies. This creates a monarchy that is leaner, more centralized, and far less tolerant of ambiguity. For some, that is reassuring. For others, it is unsettling. But it is undeniably intentional. And with the privilege permanently erased, the final question remains: what role, if any, does Camilla hold now? When privilege disappears, title alone cannot replace it. What remains is exposure, every limitation suddenly visible. Camilla's position still exists, but altered beyond recognition. And in a system where relevance depends on access, the loss of one key privilege may ultimately define her legacy more than anything she gained. Without that authority, her role now functions in a narrower, more constrained space. Presence remains, but influence does not follow as it once did. Decisions move forward without automatic consultation. Conversations happen elsewhere. The rhythm she once helped set now continues without her input, and that absence speaks louder than any formal demotion ever could. In the monarchy, power is not announced when it leaves, it is simply no longer felt, and that is the quiet reality she now faces. Recovery, institutionally, is impossible, not because of personal failure, but because permanence was designed to close every path back. The system has already adjusted. New habits have formed. New lines of authority have been drawn and reinforced. To restore what was removed would require dismantling what has replaced it. And that would introduce instability the palace will not risk. The door is not locked, it has been removed entirely. What remains is adaptation, not reversal. The emotional cost of this exclusion is harder to quantify, but no less severe. Influence once provided insulation, a sense of inevitability, a reassurance that presence mattered. Its absence leaves uncertainty in its place. Isolation inside the palace is not loud or dramatic. It is quiet. It unfolds through omission rather than confrontation. And over time, that silence reshapes identity, forcing a reckoning between what was assumed and what now is. History is unlikely to frame this moment as a personal dispute. It will be remembered as a turning point when the monarchy finally drew a line between proximity and power. Camilla's story in that context becomes symbolic rather than individual. She represents the end of an era where influence could exist without structure, where access could override accountability. That framing may be unforgiving, but it is also definitive. What this signals more broadly is the end of unchecked influence as an accepted norm. The institution has made clear that authority must be visible, bounded, and answerable. Titles alone are no longer enough. Longevity is no longer protection. In asserting this, the monarchy has chosen control over comfort, clarity over ambiguity. That choice will echo far beyond this moment. And this is why the loss of one privilege will be remembered long after titles fade. Not because of who lost it, but because of what its removal changed. Power was recalibrated, boundaries were enforced, and the story moved forward in a direction that cannot be undone. Because in the monarchy, permanence doesn't just end chapters, it redraws the entire story that follows. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.